So I've taken my cutout design, I've laid it on the wood, I very carefully traced around it. So now I'm going to cut out all of this stuff here that's not part of my design, and I'm going to use a bandsaw to do it. But my bandsaw has a 1/2 inch wide blade on it, so I can't start here and just follow a nice curve and come around. I have to make a series of straight cuts to do that. So I want to have my bandsaw blade come down in here, but I don't want to have to back out all the way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a series of cuts shaped about like this. Notice that they're a 1/16 of an inch or so back from my curve. I'm just going to come in with the bandsaw and I am going to cut down to that point and back out, down to this point and back out, down to this point and back out. So when I start with my bandsaw, I can make a straight cut here and this piece will fall off. I can make a straight cut here, this piece will fall off. I can make a straight cut here and this piece will fall off. And I can work my way around and I can bring my blade in here and never get in the way, and I can come in here and cut this piece out. And then I will have had a series of cuts with a power tool that come in close to my design without messing it up. I'll have to sand that part away. So I want to get close, but we'll address the sanding in a few minutes. This part I'm going to set up, but rather than using the bandsaw, I'm going to use a coping saw. So those of you who live off from the grid or don't have a power tool, you still have an option. If you're off the grid, you are going to need solar panels for the amp for your guitar. So in this piece, because I have the bandsaw, I'm going to go ahead and put some relief cuts in here as well. Even doing it by hand with a coping saw, I would still recommend that because it gives you more control and you're not going to bind your saw up. So I'm going to make those cuts. I'll put this in a vise and I'll finish those cuts off with the coping saw to show you how it's done. Now we move on to the bandsaw. Okay, I'm ready to start my bandsaw and start making my relief cuts. So I now have my relief cuts. Now I'm going to start going along and going from cut to cut to cut to close in on my outline. You want to make sure that you don't get into your final line. You want to sand down to that so you'll end up with a nice smooth finish all the way around. So this is now close enough that I can do the rest of it with sanding. I'm going to do some of these cuts with the coping saw to show you how you would do that. If I'm using a coping saw, I need to hold the headstock in place. So I'm going to use a vise, but I'm going to wrap a piece of leather around it so that I can clamp it in the vise and not mark up the wood. Now with this firmly in place, I can take the coping saw and I can come in and do my cuts here. And just like the bandsaw, you want to stay far enough away from your line and you want to go down to your relief cut. And you can cut your relief cuts with a coping saw as well. I did it just for demonstration purposes with the bandsaw. So now I have a roughed out design and I need to sand it. If you have a bench oscillating spindle sander, BOSS, it's a marvelous tool. They're great to use. That's what we do mostly. If you're in a school environment and you're buying a piece of equipment that kids are going to be using, Home Depot sells one by Rigid. They're a couple $100. They have a lifetime warranty on them, which for a public school is a savior. We use one of them. We use a different brand. I'll show you how to use that. We also have an option for sanding by hand. I'll show you that. So come this way to the sander. Okay, a spindle sander has a spindle and you can put different size sleeves on it to give you a different radius. The smaller sleeve gives you a really tight radius for sanding, but it's harder to control and harder to keep things smooth. A really large radius gives you a beautiful smooth curve, but it limits you as to how tight a curve you can work with. On my curve, this one is going to be just about right, so I am going to go with this size sander. It's going to fit my needs fairly well. I don't even have to change heads. So I'm going to use this sander. Now the sander is moderately loud, so you should put on some ear protection. You want to keep a square joint between the sanded surface and the two faces of the guitar. So all the time you're sanding, you want to keep a downward force on your piece. This is rotating this direction, so I want to be feeding into the direction of rotation all the time that I am sanding it. That'll give me the smoothest finish. So I'm going to do part of this here, and I'm going to do part of it by hand. Now I haven't quite got to my pencil line, but this is a nice, smooth, even curve. I might just keep that like it is. Not right at my line, but I kind of like it and it's smooth. If I try to do any more, I might screw it up a little bit. Let me show you how I would do the same sort of thing over here using hand tools. So now we're going to sand this other section of curve, a similar section, by hand. So I want that same type of curvature in it. So I've got several different curved pieces of wood and several pieces of sandpaper. And what I'm going to do is wrap sandpaper around a dowel and use that as my hand-done spindle sander. This takes a little more effort, and you have to pay a little more attention to it, and you have to watch your curvature, and you have to keep seeing where you are. But if you can put it in a vise and you can use a backing piece that's got a good radius to it. See, I'm ripping my sandpaper here and there. This is 150 grit sandpaper, by the way, for my first approach. You can see that I'm starting to get there, and it's starting to work its way in. Much slower process, but it does work, and with patience you can get there. And when you get to these outside curves, I'll take a block of wood. I like to round the edges over on the blocks of wood. Wrap a piece of sandpaper around it, and on these outside edges, you're going to be sanding like this to smooth them up. You will want to have this in a vise so that you can keep everything square. Takes a while, but you can get down to it. This is where having the right radius piece makes the sanding so much easier. That is my headstock design. I still will need to do some final sanding on it by hand with some finer grit, but we'll take that up when we get into the finishing of the wood.